The air was cold, and Eddie Grimes found himself on his knees in the middle of an arena, a massive pit surrounded by thousands of roaring alien spectators. Towering above him stood a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen, a 12-foot-tall reptilian beast with pulsating red eyes, jagged teeth dripping venom, and muscular limbs covered in armor. Eddie's heart pounded like a war drum. He clutched a crude metal spear, dented, uneven, and barely sharp enough to poke through a sponge. The creature roared, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Somewhere above, an announcer's booming voice declared Eddie's name, followed by a chorus of alien laughter that shook the arena walls. Just 24 hours ago, Eddie had been standing outside a dingy fast food joint, taking a smoke break after delivering cold fries to a particularly rude customer. He had spent most of his life bouncing between low-end jobs, constantly haunted by memories of his failed MMA career. People once said Eddie Grimes had potential, but potential didn't pay bills. As he flicked his cigarette onto the curb, bright lights flashed above him. A massive, circular ship appeared in the sky, glowing like a molten coin. Before Eddie could even register what was happening, a beam of shimmering light engulfed him, and everything went dark. When he woke up, Eddie found himself strapped to a metal slab inside a spaceship, surrounded by creatures that looked like living nightmares. Tentacled beings with twitching eyes, bug-like warriors covered in spiked armor, and a giant creature resembling a sentient pile of meat with too many teeth. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but their laughter was unmistakable. One of the smaller aliens, a lizard-like creature with a smug grin, leaned over and pressed the translator device onto Eddie's neck. The words that followed weren't comforting. "You're the new fighter," the lizard chuckled. "Don't worry, you won't last long enough to embarrass yourself." Eddie tried to protest, but the aliens had already dragged him to a grimy training chamber. The room smelled like sweat, rust, and something far worse. Fighters, some humanoid, some monstrous, trained by smashing each other into walls or practicing with weapons that hissed with plasma energy. Eddie attempted to demonstrate some of his old moves, a sloppy jab here, a sluggish kick there, but his body betrayed him. Years of binge drinking, cheap burgers, and regret had left him slower than he'd ever been. The aliens watching burst out laughing. He was humiliated. Even a robotic training dummy bested him in sparring, knocking Eddie flat on his back after a single strike. His defeat was broadcast on giant screens throughout the facility, and fighters passed him in the hall with exaggerated applause and mock bows. Eddie spent that night curled up in his cell, convinced he wouldn't survive long enough to see Earth again. The next morning, Eddie met Krexer, a retired gladiator turned janitor. Krexer was an old, grizzled alien with pale skin, mechanical limbs, and a face full of scars. He'd once been a legendary fighter until Gorlock the Impaler crushed his spine in a brutal championship match. Krexer was bitter and spoke mostly in cynical grumbles, but there was something about Eddie's pitiful state that softened him. "You're weak," Krexer growled. "But I've seen worse." Training under Krexer was a disaster at first. The old gladiator's methods were bizarre. One exercise involved Eddie hopping barefoot across a path of heated stones while Krexer sprayed him with a mysterious green goo. Another involved Eddie standing still as Krexer hurled knives at his feet. When Eddie finally snapped and demanded to know what any of this had to do with fighting, Krexer grinned. "You're not strong enough to win by fighting," Krexer muttered. "You'll win by being smarter. By being unpredictable. By being annoying." Krexer's advice was unconventional but oddly effective. He showed Eddie how to trick opponents into overcommitting with feints and false moves. He taught Eddie to spot weaknesses, how to exploit blind spots, and most importantly, how to survive. The night before Eddie's first match, Krexer visited him in his cell. He handed Eddie a crude metal spear, barely better than a sharpened pipe. Eddie stared at the weapon in disbelief. "You expect me to fight with this?" Eddie asked. "You've barely learned how to stand properly," Krexer snorted. "You think I'm giving you anything better?" The next morning, Eddie stood in the arena, his heart racing as Throg the Crusher entered. Throg was a massive, four-armed brute with skin like stone and fists the size of bowling balls. The crowd roared as Throg banged his fists together and stomped toward Eddie. Eddie's first instinct was to run, but Krexer's voice echoed in his mind. Annoy him. Let him think you're pathetic. Eddie danced around the arena, narrowly dodging Throg's hammering fists. Each miss made Throg angrier. Eddie taunted him, mimicking Throg's movements, making faces, and even slapping the brute's arm before scampering away. The crowd howled with laughter, and Eddie could see Throg's face turning red with rage. The massive warrior charged, swinging wildly. Just as Throg lunged, Eddie sidestepped and jabbed his spear into a crack in Throg's armor, a weak spot Krexer had warned him about. Throg stumbled and Eddie leapt onto his back, jamming the spear deeper. Throg collapsed face first into the sand. For a moment, the arena fell silent. Then, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, not the mocking laughter Eddie had expected, but genuine excitement. Back in the locker room, Eddie sat on a bench, clutching his bruised ribs and wondering if he had just stumbled into the greatest accident of his life. Krexer appeared beside him, grinning like he'd just won a fortune. You've got their attention now, Krexer said. That's good, right? Eddie asked. Not exactly, Krexer replied. Now they expect you to survive the next fight. That night, Eddie lay awake in his cell, thinking about what Krexer had said. He knew Throg had been a brute, an easily angered fool. The next opponent wouldn't be so simple. His mind kept drifting back to Gorlock the Impaler, the undefeated champion, the one whose name made even the toughest warriors go pale. If Eddie had any chance of surviving this madness, he needed more than luck. He needed to become something these aliens had never seen before, a fighter who didn't just hit hard but refused to play by the rules. Eddie Grimes woke up sore, his muscles aching from the previous fight. Every bone in his body felt like it had been replaced with rusty metal. The bruises on his ribs throbbed, and his legs still felt shaky from dodging Throg's attacks. As Eddie groaned and sat up, Krexer limped into his cell with a smug grin on his scarred face. Eddie hated that grin, it always meant more pain was coming. You're not dead, Krexer said with a chuckle. I didn't think you'd make it past the first round. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Eddie muttered, wincing as he stretched his arm. Don't get cocky, Krexer said firmly. Throg was an idiot with fists. Your next opponent won't be so generous. The next few days were a blur of grueling training. Krexer's methods seemed to grow more absurd with each passing hour. Eddie was forced to spar blindfolded, relying on sound and instinct to avoid attacks. Krexer threw him into pit fights against small but incredibly fast alien creatures, forcing Eddie to think quicker and move smarter. Every session left Eddie feeling like his lungs were filled with fire, but Krexer never let him stop until Eddie could barely stand. When Eddie finally asked why Krexer was pushing him so hard, the old gladiator's face turned grim. Krexer explained that his next opponent, Zyra, was no ordinary fighter. Zyra was a lean, six-armed warrior with needle-like claws and skin that shifted colors like a chameleon. He was vicious, fast, and smart. Worst of all, Zyra fought for Gorlock. Rumors claimed Zyra had killed 3 other gladiators outside the arena just to send a message to anyone thinking of challenging Gorlock's dominance. Krexer warned Eddie that Zyra would use mind games just as much as violence. The night before the fight, Eddie sat alone in his cell. He knew Krexer believed in him, or at least believed in his ability to cause chaos. But Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that this fight would be different. Zyra wasn't a mindless brute like Throg. This was a cold-blooded killer. Fear began to gnaw at him. The thought of stepping into the arena against a 6-armed death machine nearly made Eddie sick. He spent most of the night pacing, convincing himself he didn't belong in this twisted blood sport. He was just a washed-up fighter from Earth who got sucked into a nightmare he didn't understand. When morning came, the arena was packed. The air hummed with tension, and the crowd roared with excitement. Eddie could see his face on the massive holographic screens above the arena, distorted and flashing with alien text. Beside his image was a menacing shot of Zyra, his 6 claws glistening under the arena lights. Eddie gripped his weapon, a crude metal staff with jagged spikes along its shaft, and tried to control his breathing. The gates opened, and Zygrath emerged, his movements smooth and predatory. His skin shimmered, blending into the arena's background. He circled Eddie like a vulture stalking its prey. The crowd roared, and Zygrath grinned, his sharp teeth glinting like blades. The first attack came without warning. Zygrath darted forward, one of his claws slashing through Eddie's sleeve and drawing blood. Eddie barely reacted in time to avoid losing his arm entirely. Zygrath moved like smoke, twisting, disappearing, and reappearing at impossible angles. Every strike came faster than Eddie could track. Panic started to set in. Eddie remembered Krexer's advice. "He's fast. Don't chase him, make him come to you." Desperate, Eddie planted his feet and stopped moving. He raised his staff defensively and focused on every sound, every flicker of movement. For a moment, Zygrath hesitated, unsure of why Eddie had stopped defending himself. Then Eddie spotted it, a faint shimmer to his left. Without thinking, Eddie spun and swung his staff blindly. His spike caught Zygrath in the shoulder, and the assassin screeched in pain. The crowd gasped as Eddie followed up with a rapid flurry of attacks, swinging wildly and forcing Zygrath back. The assassin's cloak of invisibility flickered as his concentration faltered. Zygrath recovered quickly and lunged again. This time Eddie let himself stumble, a calculated mistake. As Zygrath reached for him, Eddie drove his staff upward and struck Zygrath's jaw with a vicious uppercut. The alien's head snapped back, and blood sprayed across the sand. Dazed, Zygrath stumbled just enough for Eddie to deliver the final blow, a powerful strike to the side of Zygrath's skull that sent him crashing to the ground. For a moment, the crowd fell silent. Then the arena exploded with applause and roars of disbelief. Eddie staggered back, barely able to keep himself upright. He knew luck had played a part in his victory, but it didn't matter, he had survived. Back in the locker room, Krexer clapped him on the back so hard that Eddie nearly toppled over. Krexer grinned proudly, but his eyes held a warning. "You've humiliated Gorlock's right-hand man," Krexer said. "That's not something Gorlock's going to ignore." Over the following days, Eddie's victories continued. He fought bizarre opponents, one with acid-spitting glands, another with tentacle-covered limbs that tried to strangle him mid-battle. Each time, Eddie relied less on brute strength and more on Krexer's tactics, misdirection, deception, and clever use of the arena's hazards. His name began to spread. The crowd started chanting for him. Bettors who once laughed at him were now putting their credits on the human underdog. But with success came consequences. Rumors spread that Gorlock's fighters were planning to sabotage Eddie. Vorin, a stern insected warrior who had watched Eddie's rise with quiet respect, warned him that Gorlock's influence reached far beyond the arena. Vorin explained that Gorlock had crushed dozens of fighters by exploiting rules, bribing officials, or arranging accidents outside the ring. One night, Eddie woke to the sound of footsteps outside his cell. By the time he got to his feet, Zygrath's scarred face appeared through the bars, still bruised from their fight. Zygrath didn't speak, he only smirked and dragged his finger across his throat before disappearing into the shadows. The message was clear, Gorlock wanted Eddie dead. The next morning, Krexer handed Eddie a small vial containing a strange, glowing liquid. Krexer explained that it was a natural painkiller, one that could dull pain long enough for Eddie to survive should Gorlock's people attempt to sabotage his next fight. Eddie tucked the vial into his belt and prepared himself for what lay ahead. His next match would be against a towering beast known as the Blight, a creature rumored to be made of living stone. The crowd was already buzzing with excitement, knowing the match was practically a death sentence. As Eddie walked into the arena, he felt a strange calmness. He knew the odds were against him, but the memory of Krexer's voice kept him grounded. "You're not here to fight like a warrior," Krexer had said. "You're here to fight like a survivor." The gate opened, and the Blight emerged, a massive, lumbering creature with eyes like burning coal. The crowd screamed in anticipation. Eddie took a deep breath, clutching his staff tightly. This time, there would be no lucky break. If Eddie wanted to survive, he'd have to become something more than just a fighter. He'd have to become a force that even Gorlock couldn't predict. Eddie Grimes stood in the training yard, staring at the massive stone wall ahead of him. His muscles ached, his ribs still felt tender from his previous fight, and his mind kept replaying Voron's warning about Gorlock. For weeks, Eddie had been surviving by the skin of his teeth, using deception, distraction, and pure dumb luck to win. But this next fight wasn't about tricks anymore. His next opponent was Gorlock the Impaler himself, the undefeated champion of the arena and the most feared warrior in the galaxy. Krexer's lessons had taught Eddie how to survive, but surviving wouldn't be enough this time. Gorlock didn't just kill his opponents, he humiliated them first, breaking their spirits before ending their lives in front of roaring crowds. Eddie knew that if he lost this fight, there wouldn't be anything left to scrape off the arena floor. Krexer limped over, his mechanical leg hissing softly as he moved. He tossed Eddie a metal disc roughly the size of a dinner plate. Eddie turned it over in his hand, confused. "You expect me to fight Gorlock with a frisbee?" Eddie asked dryly. "Not a frisbee," Krexer growled. "A shock plate. Slam it against his armor, and it'll deliver a jolt strong enough to stagger him, maybe give you a shot at landing a real hit." "Maybe?" Eddie scoffed. "You want me to bet my life on maybe?" Krexer's expression hardened. "There's no winning this fight clean," he muttered. "Gorlock's faster, stronger, and meaner than you. If you fight him straight, you'll die in seconds." Krexer paused, his voice lowering. "But he's arrogant. That's your edge. He won't expect you to outthink him." Eddie trained harder than ever before. Krexer focused on strategies designed to manipulate Gorlock's pride, luring him into mistakes, provoking reckless attacks, and exploiting every ounce of that overconfidence. Voron joined the training sessions, lending advice on Gorlock's preferred tactics. He warned Eddie that Gorlock didn't just overpower his enemies, he played mind games. Gorlock had a way of making fighters panic, of breaking their composure with taunts and calculated strikes that wore down even the toughest warriors. As the day of the fight approached, Eddie struggled to sleep. His body had grown stronger, but his mind remained restless. He knew Gorlock wouldn't give him a second chance if things went wrong. Worse still, Gorlock wasn't just another fighter, he controlled the entire arena's politics. The corrupt officials, the hired assassins, and the dangerous sabotage were all under Gorlock's influence. Eddie knew that this fight wasn't just about surviving in the ring. It was about surviving everything Gorlock would throw at him before the fight even started. On the morning of the match, Eddie awoke to the sound of shouting. Rushing out of his cell, he found Voron standing over a battered Zyra. The gelatinous alien was leaking dark fluid from a deep slash in his side. Eddie knelt beside him. "Gorlock's goons?" Zyra rasped weakly. "They jumped me in the maintenance tunnels. They thought I was you." Eddie clenched his fists, rage boiling inside him. Gorlock wasn't waiting for the fight, he was already trying to kill him. Voron helped Zyra to the medbay while Krexer pulled Eddie aside. "They won't stop," Krexer said gravely. "If you're going to survive this, you need to end Gorlock for good." The arena was packed to the brim when Eddie walked into the pit. The crowd's roar was deafening, and thousands of holographic projections displayed Gorlock's face, twisted into a vicious grin. The champion emerged moments later, stepping into the arena with a slow, confident swagger. He was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with thick plates of armored scales covering his body. He carried a jagged spear coated in a metallic substance that shimmered menacingly under the arena lights. The crowd chanted Gorlock's name, and the massive warrior raised his spear in response, basking in the attention. Eddie clenched his fingers around the shock plate hidden beneath his belt. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. The announcer barely had time to shout before Gorlock lunged forward. His speed was terrifying, a blur of muscle and metal. Eddie dodged at the last second, rolling clear as Gorlock's spear slammed into the sand. The ground shook with the force of the blow. Eddie scrambled to his feet just in time to duck another vicious swipe. Gorlock laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the arena walls. "You run like a rat," Gorlock sneered. I expected more. Eddie knew better than to take the bait. He stayed just out of reach, dancing away from Gorlock's strikes. The crowd booed as Eddie kept evading, but he didn't care. He was waiting for Gorlock to get frustrated. Gorlock's patience broke faster than Eddie had hoped. The champion growled in irritation and lunged again, overcommitting his strike. Eddie twisted to the side and slammed the shock plate against Gorlock's shoulder armor. There was a loud crack, and Gorlock's body jerked violently as the surge coursed through him. For a brief second, Gorlock stumbled, and that's when Eddie struck. He swung his staff directly into Gorlock's knee, forcing the massive warrior to drop to one leg. The crowd gasped, and for the first time in his life, Eddie felt like he might actually win. But Gorlock recovered faster than Eddie expected. With terrifying speed, Gorlock twisted and grabbed Eddie's arm, crushing it in his grip. Eddie cried out in pain as Gorlock slammed him into the ground like a ragdoll. The force knocked the air from Eddie's lungs, and the arena spun in his vision. I'll make this slow, Gorlock growled, standing over him. Desperate, Eddie reached into his belt and grabbed Krexer's painkiller vial. Gorlock's foot came down like a hammer just as Eddie jammed the vial's contents into his leg. The pain dulled instantly, but Eddie barely had time to react as Gorlock lifted him off the ground. Gorlock sneered. You're nothing. Eddie smiled weakly through the blood on his face. I know. Then he spat directly into Gorlock's eyes. Blinded, Gorlock roared and staggered back. Eddie twisted free and grabbed Gorlock's own spear from the sand. With every ounce of strength he had left, Eddie drove the weapon into the crack in Gorlock's armor, the same spot Krexer had told him about. The spear pierced deep, and Gorlock's eyes widened in disbelief. He staggered, gasping, before collapsing to his knees. The arena fell silent. For a moment, Eddie thought it was over. Then Gorlock's second-in-command, Zyra, leapt into the arena, wielding a wicked blade. Eddie barely dodged the strike. The crowd erupted in chaos as officials scrambled to intervene. Vorin appeared from the sidelines, tackling Zyra before he could finish the job. The arena guards swarmed in, pulling both Zyra and Gorlock's dying body away. Eddie staggered to his feet, barely breathing. The crowd slowly began to chant his name, hesitant at first, then louder, until the entire arena shook with it. Later that night, Krexer found Eddie resting in the medic chamber. The old gladiator gave a rare smile. You did it, Krexer muttered. I didn't think I would, Eddie admitted. That's the trick, Krexer said. Neither did Gorlock. For the first time in weeks, Eddie slept soundly. But somewhere in the shadows of the arena's halls, Zygrath's cold gaze lingered, burning with hatred and vengeance. Eddie's fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The arena stood eerily quiet the morning after Eddie Grimes' victory. The air still carried the scent of scorched sand and dried blood, remnants of the battle that had nearly claimed Eddie's life. Despite his triumph, Eddie felt hollow inside. He sat in the med bay, staring at the bandages wrapped tightly around his ribs. His arm throbbed, his face was swollen, and every breath stung like broken glass scraping his lungs. The crowd's chants from the previous night still echoed in his ears, but none of it felt real. He had beaten Gorlock the Impaler, yet the price seemed too high. Krexer appeared at the doorway, leaning on his cane. The old gladiator's mechanical leg hissed with each step, and his face carried a rare softness. Eddie expected some gruff remark or a reminder of his mistakes, but Krexer simply stood there for a moment, watching him. You made it, Krexer muttered finally. Yeah, Eddie croaked. Barely. You think that was the hard part? Krexer snorted. Now you've got a target on your back big enough to be seen from orbit. Eddie knew Krexer was right. Taking Gorlock's place wasn't just about winning a title, it meant inheriting the enemies, debts, and grudges that came with it. Gorlock's influence stretched far beyond the arena, and Eddie had humiliated him in front of the entire galaxy. He knew the revenge attempts wouldn't stop with Zygrath's ambush. Gorlock's allies wouldn't forget. And Eddie couldn't rely on luck to survive forever. The tournament officials soon declared Eddie the new champion of the Intergalactic Gladiator League, But instead of celebrating, Eddie felt a growing sense of unease. The council offered him a luxurious suite in the Champion's Tower, a sprawling fortress-like building overlooking the arena, but Eddie refused. He didn't trust the politics or the smiling officials congratulating him. Instead, he stayed in the cramped cells where the other fighters lived, closer to his few remaining allies. Vorin and Zyra remained by his side, watching his back in the days following his victory. Vorin warned Eddie that remnants of Gorlock's power were still stirring behind the scenes. Fighters loyal to the fallen champion were spreading rumors that Eddie had cheated, poisoning the crowd with doubt. Some claimed the shock plate had been an illegal enhancement. Others swore Eddie's win had been staged, a performance designed to dethrone Gorlock without a fair fight. The whispers infuriated Eddie, but Krexer urged him not to react. "Winning the fight isn't enough," Krexer growled. "You've got to make them believe you deserve it." As the days passed, Eddie's nerves wore thin. Guards were stationed near his cell, but that didn't stop the threats. A poisoned meal was intercepted before reaching his table. Vorin stopped an ambush in the training yard when two of Gorlock's former associates tried cornering Eddie with jagged blades. Every night, Eddie slept with one eye open, expecting Zyra to return for his revenge. The paranoia began to consume him, and soon Eddie felt like he was trapped in an invisible cage. The pressure only worsened when the council announced a Champions Exhibition, a ceremonial event designed to showcase the reigning champion's strength. Eddie was expected to face multiple fighters back-to-back to cement his title. The audience demanded to see if Eddie's victory had been a fluke. He knew that refusing to participate would be seen as cowardice, but accepting felt like stepping into a trap. On the day of the exhibition, Eddie stood alone in the arena once again. The crowd's cheers were louder than before, but mixed with whispers and doubt. He could feel their uncertainty, thousands of eyes waiting for him to fail. The gates opened, and a series of fighters entered, each more dangerous than the last. The first opponent, a heavily armored brute wielding twin axes, fell after Eddie lured him into tripping over a trap concealed in the sand. The second was a swift, serpent-like creature with poisonous fangs, which Eddie managed to defeat by using a broken spear shaft as a wedge to pin its head to the ground. The third opponent, a cyborg with laser blades for arms, nearly killed Eddie before Vorin's voice from the crowd reminded him to aim for the exposed wiring along the warrior's spine. By the end of the exhibition, Eddie stood bloodied and barely breathing, but victorious. The crowd erupted in deafening applause, and for the first time since arriving on this planet, Eddie felt like they believed in him. His victory wasn't just a lucky strike anymore, they had seen him struggle, adapt, and survive. But that night Zyra returned. The attack came in Eddie's cell. The guards stationed outside had been bribed or killed, Eddie never found out which. He woke to the feeling of cold steel against his throat and Zyra's twisted smile hovering above him. The assassin's claws gleamed in the dim light. "I should have killed you before Gorlock fell," Zyra whispered. "I won't make that mistake again." Eddie barely had time to react. He twisted his body, forcing Zyra's blade away from his throat. The two rolled off the bed and crashed onto the cold floor. Zyra moved like a shadow, his blades slashing through the air. Eddie ducked, barely avoiding a strike that would have opened his ribs. Desperate, Eddie grabbed the metal dinner tray from his table and slammed it across Zyra's head. The assassin staggered, giving Eddie just enough time to grab the broken spear shaft he'd kept as a memento. Without hesitation, Eddie drove it into Zyra's side. Zyra choked on a sharp gasp, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. He stumbled back, blood spilling across the floor, and then collapsed. Eddie staggered away, breathing heavily. Vorin arrived moments later with a group of guards, their weapons drawn. "It's over," Vorin said after checking Zyra's body. "You've beaten them." Eddie wanted to believe it, but deep down, he knew there would always be another threat. The arena's politics, the bloodthirsty crowds, and the alliances built on betrayal, they wouldn't simply disappear. But for now, Eddie was still standing, and that was enough. The council honored Eddie's request to leave the arena behind. They offered him wealth, power, and even a place on the council itself, but Eddie turned it all down. He didn't want to live his life looking over his shoulder. Instead, he chose to return to Earth. Krexer gave him a simple goodbye, muttering something about Eddie being the biggest headache he'd ever trained. Vorin offered a warrior's farewell, and Zyra, still recovering from his injuries, managed a weak salute. Eddie returned home to a world that felt smaller than he remembered. The streets, the people, and the dull rhythm of life seemed distant now. He tried to return to his old job flipping burgers, but something inside him had changed. The ordinary struggles that once overwhelmed him now felt trivial. He couldn't shake the feeling that the universe was still out there, watching him. One evening, as Eddie locked up the diner after his shift, he spotted a figure standing across the street. A shadow lingered beneath the street lamp, tall, armored, and unmistakably alien. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. But the figure didn't move closer. It simply stood there, watching. After a long moment, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. Eddie Grimes thought he had left the nightmare behind. After months of blood-soaked battles and near-death encounters, he believed that returning to Earth would be a chance to rebuild his life, to step back into the quiet and mundane existence he had once despised but now craved. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget what he'd been through. His mind played scenes from the arena on repeat: Gorlock's twisted grin before their final fight, Zyra's cold glare in the dim light of his cell, the roar of the crowd demanding violence. Even in sleep, Eddie found himself back in the pit, clutching a battered spear as monstrous shapes closed in around him. Working at the burger joint was supposed to be a return to normalcy, but it felt foreign now. Customers bickered over their orders, the manager barked instructions, and Eddie found himself standing behind the counter like a stranger in his own life. The sound of grease bubbling on the grill reminded him of the alien weaponry he'd once dodged. Every time the cash register slammed shut, he flinched, half expecting someone to lunge at him with a blade. He told himself he just needed time, that the memories would fade. But deep down, he knew they wouldn't. He wasn't the same person who had been abducted and thrown into an alien death sport. That version of Eddie had died in the sand alongside Gorlock. The man who survived was someone else entirely. One night, Eddie left work late, exhausted and lost in thought. The city streets were quiet, the flickering glow of neon signs barely cutting through the mist. He turned a corner and saw the figure again, the same shadowed shape that had been lingering on the edges of his life since his return. The armored figure stood across the street, half shrouded in darkness. Eddie froze, heart pounding, but the figure didn't move. It simply watched him, then turned and disappeared down the alley. By the time Eddie reached his apartment, he knew that running wasn't an option. Whoever was following him wanted something, and ignoring it would only make things worse. He closed his blinds, slid a chair under the doorknob, and slept with a wrench clutched tightly in his hand. The next morning, Eddie found a note wedged under his door. The paper was old and crinkled, but the message was clear. "Meet me at the docks at midnight. Come alone." For hours, Eddie debated what to do. Part of him wanted to pack his bags and leave town, but the stubborn fighter in him refused to run. He knew the galaxy didn't forget its champions, and whoever was waiting for him at the docks wasn't going to let him disappear quietly. When midnight arrived, Eddie stood by the edge of the pier, the cold wind biting at his face. The murky water lapped at the pilings below, and the faint sound of distant ships echoed across the bay. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, armored, and unmistakably alien. The armor gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its jagged plates adorned with unfamiliar symbols. Eddie tensed, fists clenching. "You're making a mistake," Eddie warned. "If you're looking to challenge me, you won't be the first." The figure raised a hand, palm outward, signaling peace. The helmet hissed as it retracted, revealing a familiar face beneath. "Vorin. I had to make sure you were still strong enough," Vorin said. "If you weren't, I wouldn't have come." Eddie's tension eased slightly, but confusion replaced it. Vorin had been an ally, a friend, even. If he had wanted to kill Eddie, he'd had plenty of chances before. "Why are you here?" Eddie asked. "I thought we were done with this." "We're not," Vorin said grimly. "There's something you need to know." Vorin explained that Gorlock's death had sent ripples across the galaxy's underworld. With the infamous champion gone, the power vacuum had ignited a brutal war among criminal factions. Gorlock's former allies were scrambling for dominance, and Eddie's victory had become a symbol, a reminder that even the galaxy's strongest warriors could be beaten. Eddie's name had become more than just a story, it was a challenge. Mercenaries, bounty hunters, and warlords were all whispering about him. Some wanted to test themselves against him. Others simply wanted him dead for the reputation it would bring. "That's why I came," Vorin said. "You've been marked. Gorlock's death made you famous, and there are fighters out there who would kill just to say they ended the legend of Eddie Grimes." Eddie sighed heavily, his mind racing. He had spent weeks convincing himself that everything was over, that the chaos of the arena was behind him. Now it felt like he had been dragged back in without warning. "What am I supposed to do?" Eddie asked. "You can't hide," Vorin said. "They'll find you eventually. The only way you survive this is by making sure they know you're not an easy target." "I'm not going back to the arena," Eddie said firmly. "You won't have to," Vorin replied. "But you'll need to fight, whether you want to or not." Over the following weeks, Eddie trained with Vorin in secret. They worked in abandoned warehouses and forgotten corners of the city, practicing combat techniques and countering the unpredictable tactics of alien mercenaries. Vorin warned him that Earth's authorities wouldn't protect him. Gorlock's allies worked in the shadows, outside the reach of any laws. Eddie had to be ready for whatever came next. The first attack came 2 weeks later. Eddie had just finished locking up the diner when 3 figures emerged from the alley. They wore crude armor patched together with scraps of metal and wielded serrated blades. Eddie barely had time to react before the first one lunged. He sidestepped the attack and smashed a nearby trash can lid into the attacker's face. The second came from behind, slashing at Eddie's ribs. The blade barely missed as Eddie twisted away, using the momentum to drive his elbow into the attacker's throat. The third mercenary hesitated just long enough for Eddie to grab a length of pipe from the ground and strike him hard across the jaw. The fight ended quickly, but Eddie knew it was only the beginning. More would come, stronger, faster, and better prepared. Each encounter forced Eddie to adapt, learning to fight in places where rules didn't exist. Vorin's training kept him alive, but Eddie knew that survival wasn't enough. He had to send a message, one that told the galaxy he wasn't just lucky, he was dangerous. The final warning came when Vorin intercepted a transmission from one of Gorlock's former generals. The message was clear: a bounty had been placed on Eddie's head, and assassins from across the galaxy were en route to Earth. "You can't stay here," Vorin warned. "Earth isn't safe anymore." Eddie knew Vorin was right. Staying meant putting innocent people in danger, his coworkers, his neighbors, and anyone unlucky enough to get caught in the crossfire. Reluctantly, Eddie agreed to leave Earth behind. A week later, Eddie stood on the edge of a docking platform as Vorin prepared the ship. The lights of Earth's skyline flickered in the distance, and Eddie knew this might be the last time he would ever see his home. "I didn't want this," Eddie muttered. "I didn't ask for any of it."